All right, so now we're recording. All right, so this is not going to take that long tonight. So I'll get right to the presentation, and we'll start with questions about this week's assignment. So we're going to be assessing educational intervention, which you've already started. And you're asked to do a couple of things, actually 7 things. An introduction to the intervention you're proposing is your final project, which you've already done. So it's just a matter of refining it. An assessment of theory used to develop the intervention. Does this intervention appear to subscribe to any learning theory? So make sure you state what it is. And if it's multiples, that's fine as well. An assessment of the learning determinants of the subject, and you've already done that. You may need to add some. The assessment of the technology used, including methods and types utilized were appropriate for the subjects. Many of you did that in your PowerPoint presentation. So again, just in a narrative form for your paper, and then an analysis and discussion of the study results to support your intervention, which you may not have because you haven't completed the study. So that sort of, if you haven't, then just indicate how you would analyze and discuss it, I guess. And then recommendations and alterations to the approach that you're going to have with this project. And so 5 is sort of an iffy one. 6, you can easily do that because I think you've already seen places where you can alter it. And then would you recommend a different approach or subject conclusion given your assessment? So some of you in your presentation, I haven't gotten through all of them, but some of you have recognized that maybe your audience was too broad and you needed to refine it a little bit more, reduce it, that's fine. The bottom line is that the end product only needs to be the end product. Along the way, you're going to make changes, and that's expected. That's the whole process of what we're going to talk about tonight. So are there any questions about the actual, what we're doing for this week? So right now we're sort of honing it in and making sure we have all the pieces of the puzzle there. And really, I guess the biggest thing is to make sure that you have any changes that you need to make. Read my responses to your presentations to see what you need to tweak a little bit, such as maybe the length of an objective, or maybe the way the objectives are worded. Some of the things that I saw just in the presentations was having a consistency of how an objective was actually stated. It's important to state it sort of in a similar way, so participants will be able to. Don't utilize different formats. If you get whatever format you use, stick with it. Because when you start switching it around, it makes it a little confusing for someone who isn't actually the person presenting it. You know what it is, but the person viewing it may not. So make sure you stay consistent with that. That's just for the help of the person actually taking the class, course, or module you're presenting. Does that make sense? Okay. Just out of curiosity, do you think it's easier or harder than you thought to do all of this? I mean, it seemed like a pretty straightforward thing to do, but did you find it challenging to try to conceptualize it in a very short presentation? Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
For just the mini presentation, or so far from what we have gathered?
I guess both, really. I mean, I guess from both perspectives.
The mini presentation, yes, I went over 5 minutes. It was hard to kind of fit in what the requirements for the mini presentation into the 5 minutes. But also, there's so much more within this class, material and areas to consider, and different theories and different. It's just so much more than I expected it to be. So many more aspects to it than.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good assessment, because I think sometimes, as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, is oftentimes people think, well, it's just education, it's not that hard to do. But when you really start putting it down on paper and start sort of putting it all out there, it's more challenging than you realize, and it takes more planning. I know some of you are teach in an educational institution, but you'll probably find, if you look around that institution, you won't find well-written objectives for courses or outcomes or goals stated like they should be. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, respiratory therapies actually led the way in developing the methodology towards that when it comes to health sciences. And I always find that kind of interesting when, I used to talk to my colleagues and they were like, well, I didn't realize y'all did all this. I'm like, well, this is a requirement of accreditation. And they were shocked. And you have to remember the majority of universities and colleges don't have accredited programs. The college or university is accredited, but the individual programs like respiratory or radiology or whatever specialty it is, we all have programmatic accreditation versus institutional. So we generally have more than what is ever needed for the Southern Association for Colleges and Schools or whatever regional accrediting body you have. And of course, if you're dealing with CMEs, you're dealing with the state board, AARC, or sometimes something like the ACCME, for physicians. And their standards are different, but similar to to what formal education's like. So any questions though about what you need to do for this week? It should be fairly easy because now you're just refining everything, because next week we're going to be doing the final presentations, and then the following week will be the final paper. So we're coming really close, really fast. So I want to make sure that you have any questions, we get them answered now. Okay, so just pay attention to what I've, we'll use Robert's rules. If I don't hear any questions raised, we'll move on to the next topic. All right, so if you have a question about, your presentation, reach out to me, because it's hard in those little boxes for the responses to get everything across. So I'm trying my best while I listen to the presentation to type, and it's very, very challenging. So if you have any questions, that I may have a few typos in there, I suspect. So, all right, so let's move on. All right, so we started this semester talking about doing a gaps analysis. So you had to identify what was the gap in learning that you needed to address, and then how do we act on that learning from feedback, and then build on learning with new input. So the gaps analysis was the first step in the process that we're going to talk about tonight. So when you look at the gap analysis and where does it fit into the cycle, it's the first thing you do, recognizing that there's an issue. I'm going to show you something that in a few minutes after we get done here, and just show you how technology and education evolved at the college I taught originally. And this was an old presentation that I did. So I want to just show it to you and see how it evolved throughout the presentation. I'm not going to really present it. I'm just going to show you how things sort of evolved. So we did step one. We identified what this is actually for a navigation program for cancer. So it might be you identified the current state of blank. You identified and defined the best practice needed to reach the desired state, measured how close the organization is to achieving it, and then you conducted a SWOT analysis, remember? So the SWOT analysis, after you determined what it was, then you decided, okay, I need to know what my strengths, my weaknesses, my opportunities, and threats were. And then the last step is to develop an implemented plan, which comes to this. Well, that's just your SWOT analysis. It comes to the ADDIE model. So the ADDIE model takes it the steps further that you need to go with. So for example, you've already done your analysis. You began developing your curriculum or your course or your module, and then you started designing it and developing it sort of at the same time, really. And then you began to implement it this past week. So next week you'll implement it again, but more refined, because now you've had evaluation completed on your initial presentation. You'll go back and maybe refine it based on the criteria required for that presentation. So the ADDIE model is pretty simple. Or the gap, SWOT, and ADDIE. So all of those going together are not, so they're separate, but they're part of the same process. And if you just I typically just do the ADDIE design, because effectively when you do the ADDIE design, you are actually beginning with the gap and the SWOT, and then you move through the rest of it. And so you really have already done this. So the analysis portion, so you're clarifying the instructional problems and objectives. You did that starting in week one. We started working on that. You identified the learning environment. Remember, I asked you to do that. What are the what's the, where are you going to present this information and to whom? The next phase was you started designing. So the design phase deals with those learning objectives even more specifically. Assessment instruments, you did that last week and the week before, exercises, content, subject matter, et cetera. The development. So now we're currently more in the development phase, because you kind of cycle backwards after you've implemented at least the first mini presentation. You cycle backwards and maybe do some more development, maybe some more design, and then come back and present it again. And of course, with that development, it also would encourage you to do practice. So the implementation phase develops the procedures for training and facilitators and learning. So in this case, when you're implementing it, if you were to bring on board some other faculty members to teach it, so you would, in this case, train them how to facilitate, or in the case of the learner, you would implement it with the learner. Lastly, the evaluation. The evaluation that you did with each other on your discussion board was a form of evaluation. It was peer evaluation. And I do more of a formal evaluation. So you have both formal and informal, but formative evaluations are where, I provide feedback or somebody provides feedback. And the summative, again, is sort of at the end, which we'll do week 6 and 7. So on the finished product of both the presentation and the paper will be your summative evaluation. Everything you technically have done up to this point has been formative, and meaning that we're forming the knowledge base and we're evaluating it as you progress. The goal is, when we get to the final phase, is that you've got it all put together. So that is it. That took me less than 10 minutes. Actually, probably 5 minutes, to be honest with you. And that's sort of the goal too, is you want to make sure that you're succinct in where you want to go with this. Trying not to get overly heavy with text, which is some of the comments I made in some of your presentations. So what I want to do now is just briefly show you a presentation I did for the Teaching and Learning Center when I was at Sandhills. And the reason is because at this point in 2012, we were revamping our online system. So we were moving our faculty to online learning, not necessarily because they were going to teach online, but we needed to have a mechanism so they could offer more opportunities for students to learn in different formats. And the purpose of it was, for me anyway, was to flip the classroom. For others, it was a mechanism to help them communicate to students about what their content was in a different format, not necessarily to flip the classroom. So let me just show you this real quick. We're not going to take too much time with it, but any questions though about the assignment or what we were talking about, the added design?
I do have a question that you can maybe at some point. The pre and post test that's going to be part of this, are we going to go over the expectations for that, or what, some examples, what they look like, how to compose them?
Well, most of the pre and post evaluations are going to be dependent on your material. So typically what students do is you'll take, you look at your objectives, you look at, what your expected outcome is. And the pre-test should, in the case of, let's say a procedure, is to find out what their knowledge base is going in. And I'll use one that I'm trying to remember who did. I think it was Dan. Was talking about bronchodilator protocols. I may be wrong if it was Dan, apologize. But and that's a really good one as an example, because you could easily say, you could easily present a case as a pretest and have them say, select what medications or what types of things that they would actually implement with that patient as a pretest. The post-test would be utilized to strictly have them use the protocol to see if the responses then between all the participants aligned. So that's an ideal way to do it. Now, it depends on your topic, so it's very difficult to say this is how you should do it. But I think probably what you want to steer clear from is steer clear away from having exactly the same questions from the pre-test to the post-test, because that doesn't give you any valuable information. You need to mix it. In other words, if I did a pre-test on, say, their understanding of a bronchodilator protocol, I would want to be able to, in a post-test, because my goal is to have them implement it, is to actually have them make the decision of how to implement the protocol. So the questions should not be equal. They should not be exact. Don't expect that. Because let's face it, if you ask them the same questions at the beginning and the same questions at the end, the reality is that they will likely have already sort of figured out what the answers are. So when you, what valuable information will you get? As long as the outcome that you expect is measured at the end, that's what you're really looking for. So did you have a specific question? Did you have a specific question about your project?
No, I'm just trying to figure out if you're looking for like quantitative questions. Do I have it where it's scored so then I can, eventually do something with the information that's.
Yeah, ideally you want it quantitative. Qualitative, though, is still beneficial. The problem is it's harder to measure. You can't quantify it, right? Because it's qualitative. So you would have to offer a narrative to, provide what the group that you were presenting to said. And there's nothing wrong with doing a qualitative. It's just a little bit more challenging because it's easier to quote statistics to say that, N of 50, responded this way. They were, and it's just much easier. And that's why, by the way, if you ever go on to get your doctorate, you want to do a quantitative and not a qualitative dissertation because the difference is about 200 pages between the two. Because the qualitative analysis takes much more because you have to back it up with multiple points, not just the study that you conducted. So it's much more challenging. But yeah, you could do either qualitative or quantitative, but I would do either or. I wouldn't do both. Okay, Naomi, did you have a question?
So say our pre and post would be a Likert scale and we want to do a chi-square analysis. Is it okay if the questions don't match?
Well, and that's, again, it goes back to as long as the content is measured. Okay, the problem with doing the chi-square testing, now just out of curiosity, why are you using that particular test?
I thought that was the right one for a Likert.
Okay. So you're comparing a pre and post, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you might want to simplify it and maybe go t-test it because you can determine whether or not there's any difference between the two. And that's a little simpler to do. And but yeah, if you were going to run a statistical test like a t-test or a chi-square test or any of those, you would have to have a pre and post that would reflect the same material. But there are ways to change the test, meaning like the order of the answers, for example, to make it not exactly the same. What you don't want to have is a mirror image of it. So where they memorize it. So if you're going to do it that way, where you want to measure exactly what do they know before, what do they know after, pre and post, make sure you definitely change the order. And you can do that with some technology. You can simply ask it to, reorder it according to the post test. That would at least be some way of mixing it up, or the order of the questions themselves would also help. Because I can tell you just from experience, respiratory therapists have a really good memory about things like that. So it's not that you sort of want to throw them a curveball because you want to make sure they understand it. You don't want them to have memorized something, because again, that will skew and bias your data. So even if
my other question is, with the t-test, I can get some level of significance to see if there's some correlation from the pre-test to the post-test.
Okay, well now correlation
studies. Correlation actually.
I'm sorry, what now?
I think I want to do a correlation. Okay,
well, correlation would be fine. You're going to use regression versus correlation, because if you use regression, you'll be able to capture all of that data in one calculation. Whereas if you do just correlation, you're only going to be able to tell if there's a positive or negative correlation, depending on how close that number is to the value of 1. So if you want to do a regression to get your correlation, I think that's what route to go.
And then I can do Likert scales with regression analysis?
Well, let's see, you're not going to get a mean value. You would have to do ranked order, I think. Yeah, so look up a ranked order because you would want to, yeah, I think you'd have to do that in order to get it properly, to do it properly. But yeah, I think you can still use regression. I'm trying to think about that because what you're looking at is, but yeah, you would have to use ranked order.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, so there aren't, yes. Who's that? Oh, hey, Kelly.
For burnout, would I be able to like ask questions and give them kind of the answers of like different ones, like do like A, B, and C, and give them like list symptoms, different causes or effects that it can do, and then like the post test do one that they fill in like their symptoms that they're experiencing based off of like the objectives of I have.
Well, then you would be getting into more qualitative rather than quantitative because the responses wouldn't be standardized.
Okay.
You wouldn't be able to, it would be difficult to judge. So you would be more in a qualitative area, and you can do that, but don't expect to be able to run a t-test or a correlation study or anything like that because you're not dealing with value. You're
Okay.
you're really dealing with opinion, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just more challenging, to run a statistical test on that.
Okay. Could I pull some of maybe my questions that I'm using from the Oldenburg burnout?
I mean, I think, well, actually, it's better to use something that's a validated test or validated survey or poll, whatever you're using. It's always better to use a validated version of that anyway. So absolutely. In most cases, when you're dealing with those types of systems, the permission's already been given that you can use the entire thing. And I think that, and what you could do really is use, some type of scoring system, utilized by any type of, there's different types of stress measuring systems. And so you could actually use those scores as a way to compare, participants based on, say, male, female, maybe time in profession, those under 5 years, 10 years, 30, whatever it is. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can do that, but having a standardized, valid measurement tool would be ideal for a quantitative, because then you're not having to worry about proving the validity and reliability of it, which is a problem when you're talking about statistical testing. If you start out with a test that isn't valid or reliable, then the tests you run are going to just be completely useless.
Okay.
Okay. My gosh, I can't remember. I didn't believe I remembered that much from my statistics class. I don't teach statistics, but I enjoy running statistics because I do it all the time, but haven't actually ever taught it. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of different ideas here. And this is, keep in mind, this is back in 2013, but I also want to draw your attention to how it changes, how the slides change. Now, I'm just going to move you out of the way here so I can see. I'm going to present this. All right, so this is what I presented to our TLC, and really this is called assertion type PowerPoints, or which I titled it "Be Assertive with PowerPoints," the next level. I was trying to get our faculty to move to a different type of PowerPoint system rather than trying to use, what most people would do, which is just straight text. And I always like this thing here because I feel like I'm doing that all the time. Okay, so assertion model. All right, so I'm violating the assertion model at this moment, just so you will know. But effectively, the model of delivery that uses the philosophy of stating an assertion with a slide when they're presenting with the PowerPoint. That's the fundamental principle of it. Slides are not heavy, unlike what you see here. So the goal is to emphasize a single point with a relevant visual display of the evidence. It's a student-centered design because you're taking in consideration, one, a student, you have to have flow, you have to have a cadence that doesn't bore someone. So hopefully I'm not boring you. So you want to make sure that the design is, think of a slide as one thought. Don't think of a slide as all your thoughts, because like this one, it's very hard to read because one, there's no change in the structure. It's just straight text. And I'm not going to read it to you because that's one of the biggest mistakes you can ever make on a PowerPoint. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's the bad. They're easy and good. That's good. They're packaged, which is bad. And they really become boring, which is why I don't use them anymore. But this one I wanted to present because I thought it was important. Standards are not maintained. And you're killing your students' creativity with them, by the way. So make sure that you consider that. So here's an example of how to do an assertion PowerPoint. So PowerPoints have their place, but there are more downsides if used improperly. And what I've done is I lifted the positives and negatives in a way that illustrates it as well. I do have more words on here than I'd use now, typically. I typically don't use this many words in a slide or try to stay away from it, except for instructional slides that we did at the beginning. But I do want to present this one slide this way, simply because it'll help you sort of frame everything. It's the 10-20-30 rule. Guy Kowalski developed this ideal way to do it. 10 slides, 20 minutes, 30-point font. So if you have to go to anything less than a 30-point font on what you're going to be putting on the slide, the information you're putting on the slide, if you have to go lower, the information is too much. So you really can't put a lot of information if you're talking about 30-point fonts. Now, this is a bad slide intentionally, but I wanted to kind of bring your point here. Because sometimes when we're using graphics, we tend to forget about how it looks. And to me, I don't like this slide, but I left it here because it was to make a point. It sort of summarizes what I just said, but in a different way. In other words, I've got color, I've got sort of a focus, and then I can talk around Guy's principles. I don't have this sort of straight line effect. This is a way to sort of bring it to life. So this is what I actually presented. So I shifted gears at this point, and I wanted to show the faculty, how they could change things up. The overview. I asked you to do an overview. Sometimes when you do overviews, you put way too much money in, time and the words. The overview was we wanted to discuss student access and their access points throughout the college. We wanted to look at our resources for evaluation and determine how best students learn. And lastly, we also looked at the legal and ethical issues that were related to these things that were necessary in order for us to be able to implement greater access to for students. So student access. All right, so 100% of the classrooms on campus are connected to the internet. And I broke it down this way. 146 classrooms, 25 student rooms, 46 faculty rooms and offices, 1,350 desktops, 100% with wireless access, 100% wired lecterns, with 100% with wired lecterns with LCD projection, and 100% of the offices with computers. Now that's a lot of resources. So this was part of our gaps analysis that we were looking at as to what do we have and what do we need. So we determined in our gaps analysis that student access met or exceeded the national norm, actually, which was a good thing. It wasn't a gap at all. But we didn't know that, but they thought it was a problem. We actually had 1,500 campus PCs, which was plenty for all the students we had because we had about 1,100 full-time students. We had 54 wireless ports, which meant that any area on campus could be accessed from a wireless port. So students who had their own computers on laptops, they could easily have access. And then we also identified 100 handheld devices. These devices were given out to students who didn't have the ability to purchase a PC or some other type of smart device. Student access is available anywhere on campus if they have a portable wireless device. And that was the important point. So where were they? Well, we had classrooms, a media center, student center, tutoring, sidewalk, cafeteria, student lounge. They were all over the place. So students were able to access their books, their classroom, anywhere on campus, or even off campus if they had wireless connection. So I just wanted to show you very quickly, what is an assertion style PowerPoint? It's a PowerPoint that leads off with a statement of fact. And the statement of fact here is the student access is available anywhere on campus if they have a portable wireless device. That is my evidence-based statement. How do I know that? In our effective gaps analysis, which actually became our SWOT analysis, we looked at strengths. And one of the strengths that we saw were where they had access. Now, we didn't know this until we actually started looking at it. Like I said, we originally thought that we were weak on technology, but what we found was the very opposite. Okay, I lost you here somewhere. I don't know where you got off to. Oh, there you are. And where are you? Okay. All right, I cannot see you anywhere. Get you back here. Can y'all still see? Can y'all still see me? Because I've lost you somewhere.
We're here.
Here.
Okay,
Alt
so
tab. Toggle Alt Tab and you can go between all your screens. Do you see that? Alt Tab. You can toggle through all your open screens.
all tabs.
Alt.
Yeah.
Alt tabs. Alt tabs. Okay. Huh.
There we are.
Yeah, but I don't see you. That's the problem.
It was that one screen that had that green and red bar. That left, middle left. Down, 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 down. Getting hotter, down, up, up, up there. I think that's us.
Well,
I think we're in, you want to see our faces or something?
yeah, I was just trying. Well, that's okay. That's
Yeah,
all
I'm
right.
here.
Okay, so I guess I can just do it from here. I don't have to have your faces up on the screen, but I pushed you out of the way because I needed to see the screen. And that's the problem with some of these presentation models. But do you understand the difference between an assertion style and a standard style PowerPoint? Does that make sense?
Yes, the assertion is with the statement of fact that you start with.
Right. And so then what you do is you take and create a graphic or use a picture or both. In this case is what I did here. And you try to represent that statement. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so what you want to really make sure you do is not, I could have put this all in, sort of a bullet, okay? The problem with it, it makes you as a presenter very, you want to adhere to that bullet. In other words, you want to, because we're all sort of in a process of, oh, well, this is with the order, right? But when I present it in a graphic like this, I don't have to present it in any order. I can present it in any order I want. And no matter how I'm presenting, I can do it. I can reverse it. I can spin it on its head. I don't care. I can talk freely from it. I'm not bound to it. The problem with doing standard style bulleted 1, 2, 3, whatever the ABC is, you tend to get yourself locked in, yourself, as does the audience. And that doesn't help the audience at all because they get very bored with it. And so you want to really just pull out the best of it. So find your evidence statement that you want to include on every slide and label it. And then go back and decide, what do I want to put there as the evidence? What is it that I want? Now you'll notice what I've done here with this PowerPoint also, this is why I wanted to bring this up, is I also put where the evidence was, okay? And so what I did was I pulled this from when I was completing my master's degree on educational technology. And so it was interviews and surveys completed during week 1 and week 2 of the ETO 502, which was this class very similar to what we're doing now. And the graphic highlights the various access points. So in other words, I'm only explaining it here because our professors wanted us to put in the notes where that evidence came from. So ideally, that's what you'd want to do. At the very least, what you'd want to do for your slides is instead of including references at the end, I don't know if I have a slide here that shows it, but let's see. No, I don't have it.
Dr.
Yeah.
Have you
Yes.
noticed that with teaching with PowerPoint presentations, because we've gone over different age groups learning different things, what students need versus what professionals need, that you have to then tailor these PowerPoint presentations to your audience? Like
Of
this
course.
is, you know,
Yes. 100% you have to. Now, of course, generally speaking, if you're whatever position you're in, you're going to be presenting to a similar audience. So either professionals or either students. For what I do now, I present to professionals only because I'm going to conferences. And so I have to be conscious of the fact that we have professionals in respiratory therapy or other fields at different levels of understanding. So it becomes a little more challenging, but at the same time, if you develop your slide correctly, you can upgrade or downgrade how you want to speak about it. And that's sort of the value of doing that. And, you know, I use Beautiful AI now versus PowerPoint simply because I'm not bound to the PowerPoint. I have to have it on the disk and all that. I mean, on the zip drive and all that, because it's accessible through the internet, and I don't have to have any of that. I can certainly download it and send it to the organization, but it's really not necessary. And if I want to do if I wanted to change my presentation at the last minute, I could sit there in the conference, change it, and it would appear instantaneously. It's not as easy to do that with PowerPoint or some other types of delivery devices. So that's one of the reasons I like Beautiful AI, because sometimes I will modify things because I think, you know what, I should have included this, or maybe I don't want to do that. But nevertheless, I try to stick with at least the idea of the assertion. What is the assertion that you want to make? What is the evidence that you want to present? Now, this isn't my creation by any stretch of the imagination. This actually came from Penn State back in the early 2000s, and they started promoting this methodology. When I started using this, I fell in love with it because, you know, all of us are evidence-based, and, you know, you think about all the presentations you've ever been to. You'll have somebody put a graphic up, and they're explaining the graphic, but you don't know what it means. If all they did was put the bottom line at the top, literally, or the bottom, wherever you want to put it, but put it somewhere where you know what the bottom line is, reading that graphic would be much easier than sitting there and going, what are they talking about? But I see this done every single year, and it drives me insane because they're wasting their time trying to show this graphic or, you know, a scatter graph when, you know, people are trying to focus on what they're talking about. The key is give them what you're talking about. Here's the evidence. Oh, by the way, here's the of that statement. Here's the proof. That's what you want. That's what you want to do. You want to hit it hard, and you want to make it very succinct. The more succinct you make it, the better it will flow. So now I can see you. So using an assertion style, I think, is a great way to approach this because you're doing surveys, you're doing evidence collection, presenting it that way makes total sense. So when you get to your final capstone, when you have your data, you'll be able to come up with, say, I don't know, let's say 10 statements. Those 10 statements, each statement will make a slide header, and then you'll present that data below that slide header. That's the best way to approach it because you're giving the audience what they want, when they want it, and so you're sort of satisfying that need. And it also means you don't have to talk as much on a particular slide because it's sitting right there for them to view, and you can discuss your data. So maybe how you collected it, and, you know, maybe what the issues were with the data collection, whatever. But don't be bound by bullets, I guess. You know, get away from the bullets. Put the one bullet per slide. And I'll make this comment on a number of people, is the more bullets you have, in other words, if you have more than that 30 font slide where you have, if you try to fit more than 6 points on a slide with greater than 30 points. Or you can't do it because it crams up into the PowerPoint just won't work. So keep it succinct. It would be better to have more slides and fewer words on each slide, because then you can move quickly through the slide, and it would be easier for you as a presenter, because you would notice if let's say you had 2 lines on each slide at the most, you have to move on to the next slide. You're not sitting there looking like you're reading the slide backwards and forwards, which is also another big no-no. So any questions? Because that's all I have tonight.
I actually have a question. To go back to the pre and post, since my module is directed towards students, but I will be obviously delivering it to my classmates, they're going to know the answers to my pre and post. So I don't really know how I'm going to evaluate that.
That's a good question. Well, I guess, why would they know the answers to it? Because you've already given it to them?
Oh, so my module, it will be on ABG sampling. So I'm assuming they'll all know, because it's directed towards first year students. Okay. So if you do your pre-test and they get 100%, then your post-test is going to be 100%, right? Or should be. So that means, are your questions exactly the same? I mean, I can do more qualitative, I was thinking too, but I just don't know.
Well, I don't mean qualitative. You don't have to do, you can still do quantitative by changing. In other words, again, going back to a question, So
for instance, one of my questions would be, I would ask a student, why would we perform the modified Allen's test?
All right. So could you change that to also get the same information later in your post-test? So, what was
how to test the collateral circulation, and then it would be a different answer, but the answer would be modified Allen's, or?
Right, something along that lines. So turn it upside down, and so to see if they're thinking about it, right? And who was Dr. Allen? Yeah, I used to throw history questions at my students like that. It doesn't change what you'll do, but actually, Dr. Allen, the original modified test, was the opposite of what we do, right? So, we look for collateral circulation. He was looking for the opposite. So we say it's positive for collateral circulation. He was saying negative for collateral circulation. But that's not relevant because that's not how we use it. But the point is that you can mix it up where you're asking in the same question, but in a different form. In other words, you're asking the same information, but in a slightly different format. And, if you're talking about, the sites for, to stick, then, what would be the most common site that you would stick? Something like that. In other words, they could list the sites, but then what would be the more common site? So you can still, come up with various different ways of juggling it around. Again, you just don't want exactly the same wording in the same format where they know they can spot the right answer. Okay. Because you'll see if they get it, but change it enough so you know that you're getting what you want out of that.
Thank you.
All right, so no other questions? All right, well, it's short night, so I won't keep you too long. I just had a few things I wanted to discuss, and we will see you next week. See ya.